Hey there, welcome to the first episode of the Cory Morgan Show. We're going to be coming on twice a week, Mondays from 10 till noon and Fridays from 10 till noon, so I can start up on the issues of the week, let you know what's happening, what to think about it, and Friday we can wrap them up and talk about them. So this is going to be an ongoing and interactive show. We've got the comment scroll on the left. I really do encourage and welcome people to comment. Won't necessarily respond to all of them, and we do want people, of course, to stay civil and stay polite, but you can interact with each other as well. We've been doing these things with the Western Standard, expanding our digital presence and live feeds has been going really well. Some of you may have already seen some of the Danielle Smith presentations. She's done, I believe, 4 out of 6 of them now, where she's been digging into the COVID issue in ways that no other media source has done it. I mean, they won't touch it anymore. And that's part of what's inspired this show and inspired the Western Standard is the conventional media just won't cover things anymore. They've gotten too cowardly. Like talk radio. I grew up on talk radio. Love it. You know, Rutherford, Weisbeck, Peter Warren. I mean, some fantastic shows out here. Green. I mean, there's still some good ones. You know, Gormley in Saskatchewan. He's fantastic. But we're seeing pressure coming on to keep these hosts from touching anything that might be remotely controversial. And they become fearful of it. And it's made for very, very boring media, which doesn't expose issues that are sensitive or important. And we're just left with crap. I'm so thrilled that I don't want to put this the wrong way. Thrilled that Danielle Smith has left conventional media because she's just so much better now when she can be unrestrained, ask the questions that she wants, and go into those issues. I don't know if people have been getting her newsletter. I believe if you go to daniellesmith.ca is where you can get them. She actually published, a long explanation of where she is and where she's going. But one of the disciplinary letters she got from her boss at QR77, and she said politely, she wasn't trying to shoot at a person or anything, but boy, they were on her for everything, and a long list of covering the wrong guests and talking about the wrong issues, and she just felt cornered and couldn't work in that environment any longer. And we're better for it in the sense of fresh media. Ironically, on the left, we had Ryan Jesperson up in Edmonton. He got canceled as well, and he's started his own streaming show. I believe it's on at the same time right now. But I mean, he comes from strongly left of center. But again, if you scare and tweak your media bosses, you're gonna find yourself pressured to leave or pressured to shut up. So the remaining ones in conventional media, unfortunately, are often restrained and quiet, and they're somewhat shut up, which again makes it for boring, and it's not going to expose and dig into these important issues that we really need to. So today I'm going to have a couple of guests on. At the top of the hour, I'm going to have Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He's the Alberta director. We're going to talk mostly about municipal politics. It's going to be Calgary. Not everybody viewing and listening is from Calgary, but you will, I think people can relate. I mean, there's something with municipal politics. Some of the most crazy and irresponsible politicians manage to get through the mix. It's something I've discussed for a long time. People don't like partisan politics. So, the tribalism that comes with being in a party and some of that stuff that it's fair enough. It leads to some ugly politics at times. But the problem with nonpartisan politics, as we see in municipal politics, is people slide through the radar. They'll campaign on one thing and govern on another because you never had that filter. You never had nominations. You never had a full election race or a brand attached to them to be able to see what they actually might be talking about. I see Cindy here has said, since I want to bring up comments as people can put them in. The UN directive, which is the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, I believe. That is a huge, dangerous policy area, and it's one. There's nothing that terrifies politicians or media more than talking about Native issues. I mean, those are frightening. Yet they're ones that we desperately need to address. I mean, our system, when it comes to First Nations, is failing. I mean, these people are living in misery. by every measure, health, education, crime, life expectancy. It's a disaster. Yet, always the only acceptable answer to deal with it appears to be just to pour more money at it. And then, and to do more of these things to try and actually separate and add to this apartheid within our country, which is what the reserve system is. So the UN declaration, and there's a federal bill, I don't know what it is, C-215 or something like that, that is looking to, or no, it's a smaller number. It's not a private member's bill. It's C-15. Somebody might correct me on that. But there is a move to really entrench that UN declaration, which if you read it, boy, we're never going to get any resources developed ever again. Well, we might already be in that position if we put that in. And now Cheryl's asking whether Kenny will loosen restrictions today. And yeah, that's a very good question. And that's one of the things I definitely want to talk about, because this is the day. It's another 3 weeks. We should be on to phase 3, but it seems the provincial government is always kicking and screaming. We meet our own benchmarks, but they'll always move the goalposts, make an excuse, and kick the reopening down the road a little farther. Something that was interesting this morning, I'm going to try the screen sharing here. So for those who can read it, and I'll read it out because some people will be just listening to audio. Drew Barnes this morning posted on Facebook saying step 3 of the benchmark has been achieved some time ago, and he's asking that the government honor the commitment of easing items laid out in the step 3 reopening graph. He said Albertans are well-informed citizenry capable of exercising personal responsibility for themselves and others. The cornerstone of a democratic society such as ours is that persons within the democracy exercise rights and responsibilities with the least government interference possible. Isn't that refreshing to hear from an MLA? And yes, Drew has certainly been giving Premier Kenny some gray hairs, I think, sometimes with his outspoken nature, but people appreciate it. And we need somebody to speak up because we have hit the benchmarks. So let's talk about it. Why? To be honest, I don't think they're going to open. That's my thoughts. I hope to be wrong. We're seeing a number of hospitalizations starting to rise a little bit. I mean, they're still well under the benchmark that the government set, but they're starting to rise. And that's what they'll say, is they'll say, oh yeah, but look at the trending. We can't, pardon me, I'm just trying to get better at this screen sharing. We can't do the reopening right now because we're going to be over 300 within a week. And the variance. That's the latest of the fear-mongering predictions, is the variants are going to wipe us all out and we'll be in trouble. So here I do have, this is what step 3 is supposed to look like. We have, and they do cover their butts a little bit, and they say potential. So potential easing with adult team sports, casinos, racing centers, and bingo halls. Now, these are areas, remember, that these employ thousands of people that have been unemployed for a long time. And then people say, oh, they could just get CERB and others. We're borrowing ourselves to oblivion. Not to mention it's unhealthy being restricted and locked up like this. We need to move ahead. So we got the casinos, youth sport, further easing, indoor social gatherings with restrictions. Now, that could mean a heck of a lot of things. Indoor seated events, movie theaters, auditoriums, museums, art galleries, zoos, interpretive centers. Wouldn't it be nice to get out just for a day trip to a museum again? I mean, we can't cross the bloody border. And of course, at the bottom, it says places of worship. And that one doesn't even, have that with restrictions or anything, though I imagine there would be some if they open. But that's been a big one. Danielle Smith spoke to Erin Coates, the wife of James Coates, who was arrested and was in jail. I believe he still is. That's something that Dave Naylor, our news guy, has told me. Actually, he will give me an update if it happens during the show. We're watching for if Pastor Coates gets bail, and I will let you know at that time. So will these happen? And then we've got Pat Olenberger says 300 is an arbitrary number. Yeah, it probably is. But, that's been a trend for this entire bloody COVID thing. It seems everything's arbitrary, isn't it? I mean, they toss out numbers, they toss out goalposts, and they move them on a whim, it seems like. They don't seem to know what they're doing, and that really doesn't help with our confidence. Why would I want to restrict myself, potentially bankrupt myself, when you guys don't seem to actually know what you're talking about? This is a frightening sort of thing. So I'll show here's some projections due to when they were fear-mongering on the variant, of course, the dreaded variant. And this was from January 25th. Now, I guess this started, this was supposed to be after 250 variant cases were identified. We were supposed to see this explosion and trend. And they believed even, without the variants, as you can see with the lower course, we should have 1,073 hospitalizations. We're about 270 right now, I believe. And with this dreaded variant, we should be sitting around 3,611. Again, that's well over 10 times what the reality is. This is the modeling these guys base their policy on. So how are we supposed to trust them? Their models are crap. I mean, if you can't project accurately, what good are these arbitrary restrictions? Things that Cheryl Dawn's pointing out, gyms should be essential for healthier health lifestyles and mentally and so on. I mean, we do need, you got to look at the bigger picture. It's not just getting in shape. It's good for your mental health when you've had a good workout. Here's the ICU admissions. Again, with the dreaded variant, we should be getting into the 800 people in ICU range. As I said, I believe it's 46. And with the regular, it should be over 200, again, 46. So these predictions are garbage, but we're modeling our policy based on them, and we're losing. And that's what gets people to believe, as Chris is saying there, that the whole thing's a scam. Ray Anderson saying, yeah, but they'll say the lockdowns worked. And that's true. And it's frustrating and it's painful because then you're forced into this proving a negative, But the great thing is we've got control groups out there. Texas and Mississippi, they reopened. They got rid of all the restrictions. That's it. Get out. Don't wear a mask. Go to the store. Play sports. Have fun. Live a life. And guess what? They're fine. It didn't explode. There's not the mass plague. It didn't take over Texas and Mississippi. These guys, I got their stats here. They didn't change a bit. So what's your excuse, guys? That's a lot of what we see. Their stats are the same as California. California's kept some of the strongest restrictions in the country. Like whatever is impacting the spread of COVID, its lockdowns really have a negligible impact on them at best, but that doesn't stop governments from doing it. As other people said, though, here's Mississippi. That trend is dropping right down. It should be spiking. They predicted the end of the world. Heck, Stephen King jumped in and said Texas was being irresponsible. Well, if Stephen King said so, how could we argue with that? And, fine, he's an author with a political point of view. We can dismiss that, but we've got our, supposed medical experts going on about these restrictions and saying that we've got to do this, and they aren't working. So will we see today an easing of restrictions, or will they make more excuses? And I hate to say that I'm expecting more excuses. As other people are saying, I'm so done with masks. I had a person, Twitter is a sick, weird little world, but I did have a person coming after me on my playground on Twitter there, saying that she actually does want to see masks mandated for every flu season. So even once this is behind us, because there is a flu season every year and it does kill vulnerable people every year. So she feels we should just wear them every year. This crazed zero risk mentality we've gotten into. We've got to tell these people to go to hell. It's enough. We've got to push back. I'm not saying I want your great grandmama to die, but we just can't keep moving on, perpetually shutting things down. The economic fallout really hasn't even begun to hit us yet. And it's going to be brutal when it does. Mark Cooper discussing getting Albertans back to work at the oil field. The Minister of Energy and AER pushing for big operators going forward. And he's got an interview suggestion. Yeah, the energy sector, that's another giant issue. We got a lot to cover in upcoming shows. So I do appreciate the suggestions because we really want to keep talking on important things. The energy sector, so we're seeing world oil demand rising. It's getting stronger. World needs it. They're recovering, and we're shut in. Alberta's an investment pariah because we've got a prime minister who wants to shut in our oil. We've got an American neighbor now who's shut down the Keystone XL expansion. We got Gretchen Whitmer looking to shut down Line 5, which she's quite tightly aligned with Biden, so I imagine she'll get it her way. Now we've got that old crone there, Jane Fonda. She was out opposing Line 3, which crosses the border. So, I mean, they're shutting down our lines one by one. They're picking them off. And we have to... What the hell's that? Western Standard put a comment. I'm not sure how that happened. But yes, we definitely have to get things changed. We got to get to Tidewater. We've got to get to other options. That's one of the things I believe Clinton Desveaux, who I'm going to be speaking to later on about the conservative tax on things, he was talking about the Hudson's Bay option. We had a presentation on that last weekend at a Suits and Boots conference that I hosted as well. Let's get that Trans Mountain done. That thing seems to be stalled and dead in the water. What's going on there? Energy East, perhaps. I mean, the problem we've got is we've only got one customer, and it's the Americans, and the Americans have got a doddering old man who opposes our energy sector shutting us in. So we've got that from Trudeau. We've got that from Biden. We're in a lot of trouble. So the world is desperately demanding oil and gas. We're seeing it by the prices, but it's Saudi Arabia filling the need, Venezuela, Russia. While our ethically produced energy products are remaining shut in the ground. It's just bizarre. It's ridiculous. And we're losing. Rich Rogers said when the vaccine came out, the flu mutated. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. These are fluid things. And I really worry about where the bar gets set, though. I mean, do you think this is the last infectious virus that's going to come and hit the world population? That's going to threaten people? That's going to scare them? There's going to be more. It happens. It's natural, unfortunately. We do want to get it under control, but now that we've set this standard that we will shut down the world every time something like that comes out that's going to kill 0.01% of the population, this is going to be a bad future to look ahead to. So, what are we looking at? Let's see here. I got to get better with this screen sharing thing. My arm can't reach far enough. What else did I want to cover today? See, we got a new show. There's so much to cover and so much to hit at once. So, come on, people. Talk to me. There we go. Jane Fonda. Some of these people just don't go away. So let's get some suggestions out there. What do we got with the commenters? I see a good number of viewers, though. How do we push back? How do we stop this ongoing effort to shut down our energy sector? I mean, when the federal government won't give us a permit, how can we force a pipeline? As much as I'd like to be able to say we could just crush our way through, we can't do that. So where does it go from there? All right, well, let's get on to somebody else then. The Kielburgers, since we're going to go federally. Something actually, a fantastic story at Western Standard Online. Dave Naylor put it together. Was an exchange between Pierre Poilievre and one of the Kielburger brothers, where they were discussing whether or not they'd actually been in communication with the Prime Minister's office. And Ben Chin, who used to be a CBC employee, Ben Chin is now in the communications office with the Prime Minister, and he was definitely, they've got now information linking the Kielburger brothers in direct communication with Ben Chin, which thus means the Prime Minister's office. And the stumbling, confused excuse-making from Kielburger during that, I guess you could say, interrogation by Poilievre was something else. So I should go into that. Western Standard Online, that's where our news is. There's what's called a leaky paywall. There will be a number of stories you can get for free, but after that, we will need a subscription. And I know some people have been a little upset with that, but we are independent and we aren't taking government funding like so many media outlets are, such as the CBC. We do rely on you guys to keep this content going, to keep things rolling. We need those subscriptions, and then we can get that sort of content like Dave puts up there with these great interviews. So please consider subscribing online. As well, if you're watching this, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Facebook. We get these specials. Tomorrow night, Danielle Smith, by the way, is doing another one that's going to be up and out there. It's going to be, I don't know the exact subject matter, but her theme with these ongoing specials has been the COVID-19. She did the interviews with David Redman and Aaron Coates, who was on Tucker Carlson recently. So be sure to get on there and have a look at those things. They're going to keep coming up and covering that news that nobody else will cover. Susan saying, how do we get the information and news out to the masses, not just Facebook and live stream? Many folks aren't technologically equipped beyond a TV and a basic cell phone. Well, it's a challenge, but we can share, we can push. I know that there's still the standard social media mechanisms to get things out there, but it's going to take a while. Most people, though, are online. Something that was very interesting when talking about these kinds of broadcasts, actually, I'm in Prentice, which is just outside of Calgary. You would think, though, I was in the Arctic with the internet that we have out here. It really comes and goes and can be terrible. So we've applied we're on the waiting list for that Starlink, which is Elon Musk's creation, which is going to stream internet information everywhere. But the other things that they've got in mind, I mean, this is incredible. We could finally see a world with unlimited internet streaming. They're going to build cars that are capable of receiving this. I mean, if you want to see the end of radio stations, that's going to be it. Now you can stream your music directly to your car, or your talk programs, things such as this, will be in your vehicle. It can stream unlimited to your phone no matter where you're going, so you can listen to it in your headset, or you can watch it on your phone screen. So the world is changing. The old media is changing. And if we stay on top of this curve, we can make sure good information is getting out there. A problem we have, of course, now the Liberals are desperately trying to find ways to control the internet, control what we're allowed to say, control what we're allowed to do. I'm hoping in this information age that they're trying to stop a strainer, though. It's just going to leak out. If you block speech here, it's going to spring up there, and you just are not going to get this out of here. You can't do it, but they're going to try. There's nothing that an authoritarian state likes more than controlling information. I had the good fortune way back at the end of the 80s to travel through the Soviet Union. And when I crossed from with Aeroflot from Finland to Moscow, we flew over there. And, customs came along. They searched my bags. I travel. I'm used to, they're looking for drugs, or they're looking for other illicit items. Well, what were they searching for in the Soviet Union? Back then, they were looking for cassette tapes and books. They wanted to control the influx of information from the outside world. I mean, they didn't want the poor, miserable population to know just how poor and miserable they were under a communist state. So they were trying to stop the incoming information in order to stop that from happening, which didn't work. And in the long run, it was successful. I mean, that's part of what made it crumble. When Gorbachev came along, for those of you too young to remember, it was the people saw what's happening on the other side of the wall. They saw what's happening in the rest of the world, and they said, that's enough. And if the information had been controlled, if they could control it in the 80s as they did back in the 50s, they would probably still be communist today. But as long as people can communicate, we can stop authoritarian dictators from controlling us. But we've got to be vigilant. And yes, some things are expensive. Dale Frisk is pointing out Starlink's $800 for the equipment and $150 for the subscription. Yes, it is. But using my TELUS hub right now isn't very cheap either. For those of us who are in areas where, again, with limited internet, and that's just the starting rate. I mean, as things get bigger, we and we see infrastructure, perhaps competition. Maybe there's going to be more satellites coming out. These prices will get cheaper, and it's surprising with tech how fast it is. I mean, think of 20 years ago. Could you imagine you'd be able to read an email on your phone? And the internet was there, but it had a way to go. As Dale also pointed out, yes, Putin still wants to control information and control new media. He's trying to shut down Twitter. China, yes, they're attacking the religious there, and not enough people are speaking up on it. It's been another terrible area of weakness with our prime minister and our federal government, that soft spot with China. They're committing atrocities against their people. They're a vicious authoritarian regime that spies on other nations, that steals information. Yet Trudeau just rolls over. They're holding our Canadians hostage, and at best he will wag his finger a little bit at them. It really, again, if you want to feed conspiracy theories, let's talk about why is the Trudeau government so beholden to the state of China. Where are we at? Yeah, as Dale says, it's a bargain for the internet at that sort of price. Now we got here, this really shows again where we are in our politics, especially with the East and energy here in Alberta. So this was an exchange from Twitter again. where we had Gerald Butts. Everybody knows he's Prime Minister Trudeau's right-hand man there. And Pierre Poilievre, who's been a very outspoken member of Parliament in Ottawa. He's the member from Carleton. And he was just saying freedom. He put out a little tweet with the family. He's having a beer. But the big thing was he was wearing an Oil Sands Strong shirt. And Gerald Butts says Pierre's going to make a fine next VP Ontario for the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They really do think that it's offensive that somebody wears something that's pro oil and gas, something that funds billions and billions of dollars for Canadian social programs, for Canadian infrastructure, for individuals, for pension. They see this as bad. They attack it. I mean, Butts really thought he was taking a nasty shot at Poilievre for his daring to look supportive of Alberta or even just Canadian energy. What is the matter with this nation? And this is the guy who has Trudeau's ear. This shows some of the futility, it seems, of trying to, develop our resources and get them out. This hostile environment with this federal government. I mean, he certainly wouldn't have done that if it was hydroelectric in Quebec or manufacturing somewhere or fisheries in the East. But, when it's something of an Albertan or Western bent, and you can see the root of our alienation, our crabbiness out here, then it's something to mock or shoot at or even say that it's a bad thing. So in here, at least again, one thing with Pierre Poilievre, he doesn't back down. He did respond well. He said, and you would make a fine lobbyist for SNC-Lavalin the next time they need help with the law. Because, yes, the entrenched Laurentian elite and their companies, among which is SNC-Lavalin, which the Liberals again swept it under the rug. Bombardier, so many of those central Canadian companies, executives, the elite, that just seem to be bulletproof. It doesn't matter how many subsidies they get, how bad their performance is, they remain in business, and off they go. So we should have our fellow from the Taxpayers Federation along here any moment now. Pardon me. Oh, and I'm just looking. Sorry, I got an update from Dave Naylor. I got a spammer from some guy named Mark. So it's breaking. Judge is worried that Pastor Coates' fine is not enough considering bail. So I'm not sure. I'll expand on this in just a moment here. And so, yeah, it looks like it's going to be a few more hours to hear if he's going to get bail. He's still in solitary. We still can't talk to him. I imagine if Pastor Coates gets out soon, we will be able to interview him and ask about this. His wife, Erin, has been fantastic. As I said, she was a Tucker Carlton, which is a widely rated show in the United States, of course. So we will update you as fast as we can as that information breaks. Mike Kennelly pointing out how long it's going to be before we see a budget tabled from the Liberals. I don't know. I won't hold my breath. I'm guessing, though, just to throw a shot out there, the Liberals want to go to an election. The Conservatives are still lagging in the polls. The Liberals are going to put together a unicorn piss budget that's just going to be full of baloney and projections that are unrealistic, and then say this is so important we're going to have to take that to Canadians, and they'll go to the polls. And if they win, well, they'll set the budget aside and come up with a new one, which who knows where that's going to go. So right on time, we do have Franco Terrazzano coming on board. He's the Alberta director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. These guys have been all over our governments on all their levels because those governments have been all over us and in our wallets and pocketbooks. So again, it's good to see somebody speaking up on our behalf. And the Taxpayers Federation has been around for a long time. If we might recall, for some of the older ones of us, Jason Kenney was one of the first heads of it. How things change with time. Perhaps when we're talking to Premier Franco Terrazzano in 20 years, he'll suddenly have become a fiscal liberal too. But we'll see. This is where we'll get him on the record and find out. So hello, Franco. How are you doing?
Hey, Cory. Thanks for that introduction. How are you?
Good, good. Well, I've started to kick off your campaign for premier down the road there. You're young. You got a lot of time to work on it.
Well, just make sure you hold me accountable with all these op-eds and everything that we're putting out there. And I mean, that's what we're doing with Premier Kenny. I mean, you joke about that, but one of the things that we're doing is we're showing all the promises that he made, especially with corporate welfare, right? When you have government taking money from taxpayers and dishing it out to businesses. I mean, Jason King, when he was with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, he led the charge against corporate welfare, and now unfortunately we're seeing his government dish it out left, right, and center.
Yeah, no, that's been a frustration. I mean, one of the huge ones, and you're too young to remember, but that was a tremendous thing in Kenny's time as the Taxpayers Federation head, because we had Klein just kind of taking the reins in Alberta. But one of the big things hanging on us was the provincial government had gotten into business on a number of levels, and like governments do, they failed. Okay, the mic's hot from Franco, and sorry about that. Boy, I had a technical crash there. Welcome to episode 1.
Hey, take 2. Let's go.
Yeah, so thank you for those who patiently hung in there. So now I see what happens when my computer decides to reboot in the midst of something. So we were talking about corporate welfare. I believe I was just ranting about the leftovers from the Klein government back then. If people remember MagCan, that's that big red building you see down towards High River. That thing has sat empty for almost 30 years. It was a magnesium plant that the government put $500 million in early 90s dollars into that never opened up for more than a week. Novotel was another one. That was a phone manufacturing company that went broke, cost us more billions. I mean, the list was long from back then. So which examples now do we have out of Kenny's government that's still participating in corporate welfare?
Well, we have a bunch, right? We have a bunch. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we've been keeping a list, a running tab, and we found about 14 different announcements totaling $5 billion. And I just want to make a quick distinction here. When we're talking about corporate welfare, we're not talking about the government, giving some money to a restaurant or a gym to help them through government-imposed lockdowns and restrictions. No, we're specifically talking about the government using tax dollars to handpick winners and losers. And the one that's really troubling for us is that all the petrochemical subsidies under the NDP government. We heard them announce hundreds and millions of dollars for petrochemical industry, including their petrochemical diversification program. Now, unfortunately, what we heard with the UCP, not only did they not scrap the bad NDP corporate welfare program, they brought in their own petrochemical corporate welfare program on top of that. And to make matters worse, they don't even have a cap on program costs. So taxpayers are left in the dark with this one, and we have no idea how much it's actually going to end up costing us at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, and as a capitalist and as a former oil field guy, it's always driven me mad when we see the provincial government, the federal government, they're saying, okay, we want to help the energy industry, so we're going to dive in. No, we just want you out of the way. We can do it. We know how. We're good at this. Leave us alone. Quit regulating us to death. You don't have to reach into taxpayers' wallets any deeper. Just let us do our jobs, and I promise we'll do it really well.
Yeah, exactly, Cory. I mean, what we need from our governments, especially our federal government, is just for them to take their boots off our necks. Right, you have Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law. You had Bill C-48, the discriminatory tanker ban. We know that we hear Ottawa is going to be hiking its carbon tax on April 1st. That's not an April Fool's joke. It's just a cruel insult to taxpayers. And we hear Trudeau is going to be massively increasing that carbon tax down the road, and he's getting ready to hammer us with his second carbon tax. So, I mean, it's really death by a thousand cuts for our industry here in Alberta. And you know, to give Premier Kenney some credit, because credit is due, he is doing the right thing when it comes to business taxes, right? He reduced the business tax to 8%, one of the most competitive jurisdictions in all of North America is what Alberta is becoming. But just because he's doing some things right, like reducing the business tax, it doesn't make sense for him then to turn around and harm taxpayers by taking our money and giving it to hand-picked businesses when we should be letting the market dictate who should win and who should lose.
Yeah, there's an old quote. I'm probably going to slaughter it as a paraphrase of it. Something like, governments are terrible at picking winners, but losers are really good at picking governments. It just seems that, you know, the governments don't pick the best business plan. They pick the best lobbyist, and that doesn't mean it's going to go well. They really should just stay out of it. But that temptation seems never to stop with them. So speaking of losers in government, let's move on to municipally here. You guys have been talking about, you know, the pandemic, of course, has really hurt a lot of us. People have lost jobs. Those who are still working, a lot of them have either reduced hours or reduced pay. But it appears if you're in the municipal civil service, that's not the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a great way to segue into this. I mean, there's been a lot of things that we've been extremely upset about with Calgary City Council. But just late last week, we find out that nearly 14,000 city employees received a pay raise during lockdowns in 2020, an extra cost of $27 million to the taxpayer. I mean, there's been so many things that taxpayers have a right to be outraged over with Calgary City Hall. But this one is just an absolute slap in the face to know that the private sector has been shedding jobs. The people who are lucky enough to hold on to their jobs have been taking massive pay cuts, or to your point, reduced hours. You have businesses that have shut their doors down for good, many holding on for dear life. And now taxpayers have the privilege to be paying higher taxes. So nearly 14,000 bureaucrats at City Hall could get a raise last year. An absolute slap in the face.
Well, and everything has contracted. I mean, the world has contracted. Industries, businesses. Yet, when it comes to government civil service, not that I'm dancing on the graves of jobs, but clearly there must not be as much work needs to be done now. We've got less industry, we've got less everything. I mean, where are the cuts? When are, on any level of government, we going to see some cuts from these civil service? Because we just don't need this many right now.
Well, it's yeah, I mean, to your point, it's the number of bureaucrats, but there's one way where we know we're not going to reduce services, but still get more bang for taxpayers' bucks. And that's if government employees take a pay cut, right? That would save money right there. Instead, we see the opposite. Nearly 14,000 City of Calgary bureaucrats getting a pay raise last year, costing us $27 million. But guess what? 2020 was not the first year of the downturn in Alberta. We've been in a downturn for more than 5 years, right? It wasn't like 2020, all of a sudden we have a downturn. So really, we've seen City Council asleep at the wheel for the last 5 years. If we go back to 2015, the cost of pay raises for the city bureaucrats put taxpayers on the hook for an extra $230 million. I mean, Cory, to me, that is a significant sum of money, and that's extra taxes for families and businesses who can least afford it.
Yeah, I mean, we need a break. These businesses are hanging by a thread. And again, we've got Calgary Economic Development, who's been sitting on, I don't know what's left of $100 million fund to try and dole out to the winners and losers they're trying to find. But a lot of the existing businesses, there are some that are still operating. They just need a break. They need the city just to, as you said, get off their neck, and they will happily contribute, I guess you could say.
Well, remember back in 2019, the spring of 2019, it was only about a few years ago, but it seems like a decade ago, just with a whirlwind of all the things that have been happening since then. But in 2019, there was a Calgary business tax rally at City Hall. And I was there. I ended up speaking to council that day, and I talked to as many business owners as I could speak to. And the common thread that I heard from almost every business owner is that all they want is for the city of Calgary to spend their tax dollars wisely. Right? To stop with all these crazy benefits, to stop with all the art projects, to stop with all of that kind of stuff. So they wanted City Hall to spend money wisely and reduce their tax bill. I didn't hear a single business say that they wanted corporate welfare. I didn't hear a single business say that they want the bureaucrats to be giving them other people's tax dollars. But to your point, which you've raised, we see the city of Calgary sitting on $100 million corporate slush fund, right? That's money taken from taxpayers, in many cases struggling businesses, and then used by these bureaucrats to be picking winners and losers. Cory, I just did a quick check today, and there's still nearly $60 million in that corporate slush fund. Immediately, that slush fund should be drained, and those tax dollars should be going back to struggling businesses.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we got the bird in hand. We got the companies that are successful. Why be chasing other ones when these ones are struggling? Why lose 10 Calgary companies to try and draw in one maybe down the road? Miriam Rashley, that's probably correct, has asked the question, though, the tough one, because it's easy for us to bitch, and we do. That's what we're about. But what's the solution? What do we do? Get a civil lawsuit against the municipal government? She's getting tired of the bad news. And yeah, there's always a lot of bad news. So where can we go? How can we turn this around? What do we got to do here? Or what is the government going to do here?
Well, the government has a laundry list of things to do. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, along with some other advocacy groups. I mean, Cory, and you were there for this press conference. We held a press conference that showed 21 different ways for City Council to cut the fat in 2021. The whole point of that was to show that there's still a ton of fat at the city of Calgary where they can still cut. To answer part of that question, there's a laundry list of what governments need to do. To get to the more difficult question in terms of advocacy, well, there's many different things. When it comes to the city of Calgary, you have to attend their budget meetings. You have to be there to show that Calgarians actually do want the government to reduce spending and reduce the tax bills, right? If you don't show up, I mean, you're not going to make an impact. The other things to do is go to taxpayer.com. You can join our organization free of charge to get our action updates, to know when we're hosting events. And with COVID-19, it's typically virtual right now, or when we're hosting other types of mobilization efforts. But the big thing is you have to keep contacting City Hall. You have to keep contacting your MLAs and MPs, especially in the upcoming election. I mean, we're going to be publishing a list of questions that you should be asking each councillor candidate when they come knocking on your door.
Yeah, well, and this is the year, if any, they're going to be listening. I mean, that's been a trend. It used to be a 3-year trend. Now it's a 4-year trend where suddenly they all turn into conservatives and responsible people for 6 or 8 months leading up to election. And then, of course, the election passes, they go back to their free spending, irresponsible ways. Teresa Shorey, because you did put out yeah, I remember that. It was freezing cold on the City Hall steps that day. 21 items to cut. And she's asked us, you might not have it immediately on hand, but still, where's your top 5 of the laundry list? Which ones can you really point at?
Yeah. So first, I have to say it has to be across the board. Right, you have to see spending reductions across the board. On that list, we said that the city of Calgary should bring its spending across the board back down to 2014-15 levels. Right, that's right before the downturn began. So we're saying, look, families and businesses have found ways to find savings throughout the downturn, and that's where the city of Calgary should be looking to reduce spending across the board. And Cory, just one point is that we saw spending at the city of Calgary massively increase in 2013. And it's kind of reasonable why it did, right? To deal with the floods. That was a huge situation for Calgary. But the problem is that we haven't seen spending levels be brought back to pre-flood normals, so to speak. So the problem is they massively increased spending, and we've just seen spending increase year after year. So the first one is across the board savings. The second one is you have to go at the elephant in the room, the cost elephant in the room, which we've been talking about, which is labor, right? Salaries, the number of employees, and the crazy benefits. Maybe that's point number 3, is these crazy benefits. Not only are city employees receiving a generous defined benefit pension plan at a time when most workers outside of government don't get a pension plan, but there's hundreds of City of Calgary employees receiving 2 or 3 pensions, which is just completely ridiculous and out of touch. The fourth one, it has to be corporate welfare, right? Let's start with that $60 million left in the corporate slush fund that the City of Calgary is on top of. And, let's lump in number 5 with just the priorities. We need our councillors to have or exercise some common sense to say what is necessary, what is not necessary. We should only be focusing on the essentials right now. I'll say something that maybe some of your listeners will agree, maybe some won't, but the $300 million that Calgary taxpayers are on the hook for the Calgary Flames arena is absolutely non-essential. And look, I'm a huge fan of hockey, but the thing is that we should be supporting the Flames with tickets and not with our tax dollars.
Yeah, that is a controversial one. It's funny and frustrating sometimes how many hardcore fiscal conservatives suddenly open up a big exception when it comes to their favorite sports team. These are companies, these are businesses, and they can be viable ones, just like any other, if we create the right environment for them to operate in. I mean, maybe there's ways we could have facilitated a stadium or things like that without such a direct injection of taxpayers' dollars on it or an arena. But once they do that, we're down that rabbit hole and we sink further. And of course, it's always, well, that city did it, so we have to do it. Well, the race to the bottom, unfortunately, costs us all dearly. Is the city hiring more people? Like I saw a bizarre job posting. Save Calgary threw that out on Twitter for a position of some kind of really strange name of a manager of people person or something. I'm guessing maybe it was human resources. And it gave a pay range of, I believe, $170,000 to $320,000 a year, which again was bizarre with just how wide that range is they were advertising for. What roles is the city filling right now? What are they doing in there that they're bringing on new staff of an indeterminate role at that price?
Well, that's a great question, especially when we're in this massive downturn, and a downturn that we've been in for more than 5 years. Now, sometimes I hear councillors and even top city administration, the top city brass, talking about these savings that they're finding labor. And I just don't know what they're actually pointing to, because when I look at the city's annual reports, I've seen labor costs increase by hundreds of millions of dollars during the downturn. I've seen a ton of new full-time municipal employees being hired during the downturn. So they're talking about all these savings that they're finding, and I don't know what they're talking about, because when I'm looking at the city of Calgary's annual reports, which you can find online, I'm seeing the exact opposite. I mean, maybe they're talking about, well, they're spending less than what they would have wanted to spend on. Right. But if you ask families in the real world, if you ask businesses, we'll tell you that that's not actually finding savings. If you remember the letter that Mayor Nenshi sent with the property tax increase, it talked about finding all of these savings. But if you look at the budget year after year, spending is going up.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard math. And another area, it comes down to efficiencies, which is a little more difficult to define. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that. A picture I like using from a blog posting I wrote years ago, but I'd seen it posted by somebody, and they'd taken it from a +15, and there were literally 10 people standing around while one guy painted a green box on a bike track. And I tweeted it out. I think that's the last time Mayor Nenshi ever responded directly to me on anything. But, it's really, how many people do you need to paint a green square on a roadway. And he did respond, say, oh, this is different. This was a bike box, and we just wanted to make sure to have it right as we do more. It's a green box, Nenshi. You can't polish that turd. You do not need 10 people to do this. What is going on with you guys? All these safety vests, and I imagine they're all making $30, $40, $50 an hour. What are you people doing there? And we see that, unfortunately, with civil service. I know it's the start. There's some very hardworking people out there, out there, highways and maintenance and city jobs. But there's also just a terrible amount of redundancy, inefficiency, and it does often come back to organized labor. That's always the big elephant in the room. How do you get particularly the civil service unions to start talking reasonably about, as you said, rather than layoffs, let's examine pay cuts, rather than, cutting programs. Let's see how we could do them at a better rate then so we can do more of them. But they just seem intractable.
Well, there's so much to unpack there, Cory, really. It all comes down at the end of the day to, are you getting value for the city services? Are your tax dollars being spent wisely? And I think it's not only that the city of Calgary is spending a ton of money, it's how they are spending that money. And I don't think you can go to Calgary taxpayers and tell a Calgarian who might have just lost their job, might have just taken a 15% pay cut, or might be a small business owner who just laid off 2 of their friends, and tell them that they have more than 100 City of Calgary employees who are receiving 3 pensions. I don't think too many of those Calgarians would say that that's a good use of their tax dollars. I'm a Calgary taxpayer, and I can tell you, I don't think that's a good use of my money. Especially when the vast majority of Albertans outside of government don't get a single pension. So to your point, this often comes down to the city's unionized government union bosses that we need our councillors to have a political spine and arm wrestle with. There's great data published by secondstreet.org, a Canadian think tank, and they asked the city of Calgary, when was the last time that unionized employees took a pay cut? Surprise, surprise, data going back to the 1970s show no records at all of their city employees ever taking a pay cut. Now, in terms of how do you actually solve this problem, you have to take a page from Premier Ralph Klein back in 1994, right? What did he say? He said, we're going to cut the budget by 5%. Either you take 5% further layoffs, or you take 5% wage rollbacks. Now, fortunately, we saw the union bosses agree to a 5% wage rollback, but that's the type of tactic that we're going to need to see our politicians take here.
Yeah, well, and some of those labor bosses themselves are making some pretty healthy coin from their union members. I think there might be some room for efficiency on their union dues. Maybe if they took a bit of a wage cut, but they also had a reduction in union dues to help offset that. Maybe the pork at the union level needs to get a little bit of trimming as well. And getting to that, what's with groups? Alberta Federation of Labor, good old Gil McGowan there. He's also been very outspoken about reopening. I'm not asking you to make a medical opinion here or anything, but again, it really comes down to, it seems odd, labor organizations pushing so hard for people not to go back to work. They are happy to have people paid to sit at home, but how long can we afford that trend? We just can't seem to do it. But the priorities of labor unions just really seem to be skewed.
Well, and certainly it's going to have to be taxpayers one way or another who are paying that money back, right? Whether it's the provincial government where we have to pay higher taxes or higher debt, which eventually is taxes, or if you look at the federal government where it's the same thing applies, more taxes, but also could be inflation, a reduction in what our money can actually purchase, right? That in and of itself is a higher tax. Now, one key thing that I want to bring up, because we've been talking about labor, and it's clear to me that there's a huge divide in Alberta between 2 classes of people. One is the government employees who have been completely shielded or largely shielded from this downturn. Many, as we've been talking about, have been made better off. And then the other group of employees, and that's private sector workers and business owners who've been taking it on the chin for the last 5+ years and who have been forced to pay for this growing tab. So there has been a class divide here in Alberta, and we've also seen that when we're talking about private sector versus government unions. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we put out a report back in December that showed we found nearly 300 government union wage settlements in Alberta that resulted in a pay increase. We didn't find a single one of those since 2015 that resulted in a pay reduction. On the other hand, we saw more than 100 private sector unions agree to a pay reduction. So you can't tell me that just because it's a union that they can't take a pay cut, because we saw that happen across Alberta during the downturn, because private sector unions, they realized like, hey, we want to keep more of our staff employed. We want to make sure our businesses stay afloat. So they were willing to share in the downturn.
Yeah, there is a big difference, and it's worth distinguishing between the private and public sector unions. I mean, the private sector ones, I think, have a bit of a better understanding that, they can kill the golden goose. If they keep pushing, there's just not going to be any more to take. Public sector seems to have a bit of a mindset that it's just the magical money machine. We can just keep printing it, and there won't be consequences, and government can keep spending and borrowing and spending and borrowing, which I think the whole world's in for a big lesson on that pretty soon, I'm afraid. Just to expand a little, though, because, you guys have mentioned this a lot before, and it's a big one, but it seems inconceivable, and it's worth just keep hammering to show how crazed some of these compensation packages are. Ray is asking, Ray, how can someone be able to get 3 pension plans? How is that working that way? Is it past negotiated settlements or something?
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous, but let me explain kind of how it works. So, and it's not just happening at the city of Calgary. We actually found thousands of municipal government employees all across Alberta that are eligible for 2 or 3 pensions. But at the city of Calgary, it's a big one. The cost of the second and third pensions for Calgary taxpayers was about $15 million, and that's an annual expense, $15 million. And so how it happens is, you have a very large portion of City of Calgary employees that get their defined benefit pension plan, your basic defined benefit pension plan, and that pension plan provider actually refers to itself as being quite generous. And let's remember, the vast majority of Albertans outside of government don't receive a first pension or any pension, workplace pension. So on top of that first pension is a second pension, and it essentially tops up the benefits of the first pension. So it tops up a portion of that first pension benefits. Now, the third pension, where there was a little bit over 100 employees who was receiving that at the city of Calgary, what it does is that it tops up the pension for high income earners, right? So high income earners up to a cap, they don't receive any pensionable earnings on higher levels of salary, but this third pension allows them to get pensionable earnings on their very high levels of salary. And what's crazy about this third pension is that it's 100% taxpayer funded. So just to reiterate, they get this first pension, the second pension tops up pension plans for all, for over the whole range of the salary, and the third pension top up is just for those real high income bureaucrats, and it's 100% funded by taxpayers.
Yeah, and that's striking. I mean, in the private sector, for those companies that even do have a separate pension plan, the best you could hope for is maybe some employer matching on contributions and things like that. But there's no such thing as 100% funded on their part. I mean, you both got to kick into it, or typically. So one of the things that helps, though, and as it was asked, is we got to shine a light on this because it slides under the radar. People don't see it. Again, we had a mayor who very much promised the most transparent civil or municipal government on earth. It's been quite the opposite. They spend more time hiding in camera and covering up. I mean, you guys have got to wear your fingers out trying to get those freedom of information requests for information that really should have been public in the first place. Where and how do we get more of that? Like, is there, I know the Manning Center had been doing voting tracking and so on before, because as we're in an election year, I think it's really important to see just where all of these candidates, at least the incumbents, stand and where they've actually been, because they say one thing and they vote quite another. Is there a place where people can find that and see that now?
Well, I mean, I do think it's a place for advocacy groups to really pick that up. So hopefully we will have someone put out that information. And I think we need our counselors just to exercise some common sense and to understand that they work for the people and it's not the other way around. So they should be doing most of their work, the vast, vast majority, in front of the camera, right? In front of the public's view. Now, I do think this is a good thing for an advocacy group to pick up. Quite frankly, I don't always trust everything that I hear from City of Calgary or city administration, right? So I would actually prefer either these votes be published online and that's it, or to have an advocacy organization publish those.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it should be published. It's they're voting on our behalf, on taxpayers' behalf. I mean, why is this so hard? You know, we have it provincially and federally. We have Hansard. We shouldn't have to force. And then I appreciate, advocacy groups to dig through. I mean, I've watched city meetings. I mean, part of what they do too, and I do believe it's a purposeful means of just being non-transparent, is when they have a long schedule during the day, it's kind of flexible. So the portion you want to hear about, you don't know when it's going to be. So you got to sit through the droning of a lot of, perhaps important but quite dull matters that they have to go through as a committee and council. And then you fall asleep and you wake up and you find out the vote passed. And you don't remember how they voted. So, they should just have that encapsulated up there. Maybe we could ask people to ask their candidates to commit to that. I mean, this isn't that hard, I mean, put one bureaucrat on it. There you go. There's one of those job shifts you can do. And they can post those voting records up there online in perpetuity so we can always see how our representatives are voting.
Yeah, I guess it would be pretty easy, hey? And that should be basic transparency. I think, to your point, the Manning Center formally used to release stuff like that, and that was super helpful. So hopefully in the interim, we do get an advocacy organization that posts something. But I do think that would be something when you get your councillors knocking on your door this fall, something to push them for.
Yeah, well, and I mean, as we know, Jeremy Farkas was instrumental in that Manning Center initiative, part of the council tracker, and then he's been a city councillor and now running for mayor. But I know some of his biggest, where he would have a lot of explosions in city council, I guess, or where they would get most ticked off at him, was in areas where he'd push for transparency. Was when he was talking about a roll call. Did they show up for work or not? Let's get that down, or let's not go behind closed doors for these things. So hopefully more of that pressure, because they bristle. They don't want to actually have to speak to the electors. I mean, this is the time of year when they're going to.
And Cory, can I just interject with another point? Do you remember the absolute debacle in the way the councillors passed the arena deal? If you can remember, it was back in the dead of summer when they really started pushing on it, and they gave Calgarians about a week, and I believe it was at the end of July, to just think about this arena deal. So it was a week, and then they rubber stamped this hundreds of millions of dollars for the Calgary arena. I mean, they spend less time discussing it publicly than they do discussing the most minute city operations. And we're talking about an arena that's going to be putting taxpayers on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars. And it wasn't like this was an overwhelming support from Calgary taxpayers. I mean, I even remember councillors saying that, well, maybe half of the people who emailed them about it opposed it, half of them supported it. So how do you only give taxpayers about a week to talk about this thing in the dead of summer? I mean, to me, that shows a complete lack of transparency. And even if you support the arena deal, there's no way you should support the way this council went about it.
Well, no, and that's been consistent with city council too, though, and city administration. I mean, consultation, when they say it, is an insult to the definition of the word. We've seen that so many times over and over again. I mean, back when they were closing parking and lanes for bike tracks through the Beltline area, they did their supposed town hall meetings and consultation, and these were not consultation. These were advertising projects, and they were... they overlooked what concerned businesses who were losing vehicular customers about, and just listening to the handful of hipsters who had nothing better to do and come in and say they like it. We see that in so many levels. Now we're seeing it actually with, I know you didn't dig too far into that one, but the city guidebook for community developments. And that's been a heated area lately, because they're cloaking this and saying as if it's just a guide and a document that's just going to, help move in a direction of development. But no, that thing's a binding document. This thing will force community developments in a way that are contrary perhaps to what consumer demand will be, but they're purposely and deceitfully, in my view, trying to slide that past voters, and that's really problematic.
Well, I mean, all of this also reminds me of the Calgary 2026 Winter Olympic bid boondoggle. There were so many reasons to vote against that bid. Fortunately, the people were allowed to actually have their say. I think a large part of that actually has to go to thank you to the Alberta government at the time, who said that funding would be conditional on the plebiscite. So fortunately, we were able to get our say. But one of the big reasons that people were opposing the Calgary Olympic bid was just the lack of transparency, even around the costs. I mean, it ended up falling on the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, me at the time as well, who published how much it was actually going to cost each household to fund this thing. And you know, we're happy to be putting out that information. But don't you think that probably should have been the first piece of data that was given to Calgary taxpayers by the bid corporation, by city councillors, was how much is it going to cost a household during this massive downturn? Again, we're happy to put out that information, but don't you think that should have been the first thing that they published?
Well, and again, you know, I credit where due, and I sure don't give Rachel Notley a lot of credit, but even the NDP knew a boondoggle when they saw it in this case. And they said, okay, you know what? If you want that, fine, but you run that by the voters. I'm not touching this thing. And Mitchie was livid. I mean, he did not want to have to go through that process. It was clear. And that's part of why I think they didn't have a good plan to sell it, because they didn't think they'd have to. They thought they could just run this under the radar like they are with the guidebook and it'd be a done deal. And yeah, talk about dodging a bullet while we're in a city in complete distress right now. And if we were somehow trying to build up for a future Olympic Games while we're at it, it would be, it's inconceivable. I mean, it's nuts. And I like to note, though, the person who headed that Olympic bid push, you know, for there was millions of dollars spent to promote this, too. It wasn't consulting, it was promoting. They call it consulting, but they were pushing, was, again, Mary Moran, who's now the head of Calgary Economic Development, doing such a bang-up job there. And some of the, you know, strangely vocal volunteers on social media promoting the Olympics, just doing it out of the goodness of their heart, found themselves in positions of salary with Calgary Economic Development. That was a kind of a funny game.
Weird how that works out, hey, Cory? And I'd just like to point out, like, there was a volunteer yes side, right? But the real yes side was the bid corporation. The real yes side that I was worried about every day was the taxpayer-funded bid corporation. Now, can you imagine that your tax dollars going to fund essentially a propaganda campaign that you completely oppose? To me, that is a non-starter. And I mean, even if you were one of the people who did support the Calgary Olympics, even that shouldn't have passed the sniff test for you. And make no mistake about it. I mean, I was in the trenches. I was in that fight, and the bid corporation was on the yes side.
Yeah, no, and there were some. It's unfortunate we see kind of, I guess you could say, the elite, the big players, there's a certain class of people, I guess, and they're in the business community as well, but they like taking part and playing in these tax-funded ventures at times, and it's disappointing sometimes to see. But I mean, it was fantastic. It was great to see the Taxpayers Federation really push, among with other groups, Common Sense Calgary, all those others, or even me being a nagging pain in the ass on Twitter. But voters got up and they told the Olympic proponents to take their bid considerations and put them where they belong, and really saved us from a lot of trouble. So I will let you go. Thank you very much for joining me today. There's always lots and lots to cover. Municipal is a good area. We'll have to get you on. I'm sure there's going to be some federal and provincial stuff we can always go on about too at length. So where, again, can we find more information on what you and your organization are up to?
Well, the best place to go is just to taxpayer.com. A great resource there is a newsroom, so please check that out.
All right, thanks, Franco. And thanks for filling in while my computer decided out of the blue to reboot there for us. So that reminder, if it happens again, though, I'm going to fix this problem, damn it. Your mic was hot while you're on. I imagine you didn't say anything too blistering or anything. If it was me, there probably would have been already, we'd been demonetized and censored for some of the words that would come out of my mouth from my old oil field days. So thanks again. I'm certain we'll be talking again soon, Franco.
Well, thanks, Cory, and congrats on your new show.
Great, thank you. So moving on, something I do want to mention is we have had a sponsor who's been helping us out. She's running a local business. It's kyrensway.com. As we move into these digital shows and improving on them and getting better, again, we aren't tax funded. We need sponsors. We need people to come out. So, hey, if you want your brand or company or name out, get a hold of me or get a hold of Daryl at the Western Standard, and we'll certainly work something out. It's a great way to speak to local listeners and put them together with local businesses and services. And what Penny offers at kyrensway.com is means to deal with stress, anxiety, those things we're all dealing with right now. Some people better than others. Some people are turning, unfortunately, to drinking, or sometimes they go to the doctor and they just quickly get prescribed with an antidepressant, which works great for some people, but not necessarily for others. Kyrens Way and what Penny offers is a holistic sort of solution, where we look at your diet, we look at your lifestyle, we look at a number of things, because your mind and body are connected. You need to fix them both to feel better. That gets a bit back to the lockdowns and gyms as well. Those things are important. So, if you're considering, you're a little stressed out, you think you might need a little help with some things, get a hold of Penny at kyrensway.com. She might be offering just what you need, and consultations are free. So, moving on and back, and I'll just respond to one quick comment from somebody who says, Cory, have you ever thought about running for mayor? Short answer, no. And you rest assured, one of the things that a mayor needs to do, and that's been one of the problems with Naheed Nenshi, is you've got to be a really good team player. You've got to be patient, and you've got to be able to keep a team together in City Hall. I didn't like Bronconier very much, but he was good, at least in getting some degree of consensus with councillors. Part of the problem we have right now, of course, is Mayor Naheed Nenshi runs a hornet's nest in council, and it just very little gets done aside from the fighting with each other. And if it was me in there, oh man, I would have thrown a microphone at one of them by now or something. The other part is, too, I live just outside the city of Calgary. I'm right near the city limits, so I wouldn't qualify to run for mayor, even if I wanted to, but I don't. So, moving on, we've talked municipal. We got some provincial things. We've gotten no news from, it's been put off for the bail hearing for Pastor Coates. I'm going to talk to Clinton Desveaux, and Clinton's been very involved in federal politics, conservative politics, and outspoken on it. This last weekend, we had the Conservative Party of Canada convention. They had a lot of discussion, debates, some policy motions, and, let's talk and see if these were productive or just the way things need to go. So, welcome to the show, Clinton. I appreciate you coming on.
Should I say good morning?
I should also note that Clinton's coming from. It's still morning here. Clinton's out in Halifax, so he's got a different perspective. The day's farther ahead for him over there. And yes, I'm afraid my internet's acting up a little bit. So as again I said before, if I freeze up, just carry on, Clinton. I know you're very good at speaking at length. So that's
the last thing your audience will
hear about.
By Clinton Desveaux.
Well, we'll see. I mean, they can only listen to so much of me as well. So the convention went last weekend. This is most likely, welcome to the parliamentary system, an election year, possibly within a few months, maybe this fall, who knows? But it makes it all the more critical for these events, these conferences, things like that. Did they achieve what they wanted to last weekend?
Quite frankly, no. I think there's consensus that's been forming over the last couple of days from the public at large that, unfortunately, Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party, basically used his opportunity of his big speech Friday night to talk to party members and not talk to Canadians at large. To your point, with an election sometime a month to 2 months away, this was a real opportunity for him to talk to just regular Canadians. And his message seemed to have been focused on Conservative Party members and telling Conservative Party members that they need to accept change. They need to accept change. And I think that left a lot of Canadians at home watching, or the few that did watch, sort of scratching their head and wondering, well, why would I want to support this party if they don't believe that they're ready to govern?
Yeah, well, and something that happened, and I wrote a piece in a different publication that came out on that today. And it's just, I'll kind of expand on what I wrote about, though, because it's a frustrating thing in conservative politics and party politics. But I saw a federal party kind of repeat the history of the Wildrose Party, I thought. In one of the areas that they've been getting battered and bashed on a lot was climate change. And they're being labeled constantly, candidates and individuals, as climate change deniers, which I find is a bit of an odious twist on trying to make it sound like a Holocaust denier. But it comes to a point, if you don't agree with a particular liberal policy on climate change, then you are a climate change denier. And it hurts. And it's been effective. And that's part of why the Liberals keep using that hammer to beat them with. And we had that with the Wildrose Party in the past in Alberta. They were stuck in opposition for 2 different terms. It was LGBTQ issues that really would beat on them, though. And they had one outspoken candidate, Huntsberger, who was talking about gays burning in a lake of fire. I mean, it gave them all sorts of ammunition to label the entire Wildrose Party as being anti-gay. So what, though, the party brass decided to do was put in this policy motion to say right in our policy set that our party supports LGBTQ rights. And what happened was there was a lot of discussion on the floor, and the members got up and said, no, we're not putting that in our policy. We support equal rights for everybody. We're not going to start slicing and dicing down to each and every group. I mean, part of my case, I voted against it too, is, well, where do we go? Do I also say we support Black people? Sure. Do we support Inuit people? Sure. But then you start that process of exclusion. That means if you didn't have it in the policy, does it mean you didn't support that? Like, it's just an ugly road and an apologetic one to come from. It's defensive. And I mean, I know what they're trying to do, but it shows that you have to always wear it on your sleeve to keep repeating, flagellating. I support this, I support this, I support this. It's almost like the person saying, I have my Black friend, thus I'm not a racist. You've got to do it through your actions, through your policies, through over time. I mean, crack down on those candidates who are anti-gay, crack down on the other things. I mean, so we saw that with the climate change thing. They wanted to insert a policy that said, we believe in man-made climate change, or that climate change is real. And again, memberships got up and said, no, we don't want that in there. And it doesn't mean that the members didn't necessarily believe in climate change. It's just they didn't want that policy. But now what happened after both conventions, the Wildrose one and this one, I mean, the headlines at the Wildrose one were, Wildrose Party rejects policy to support gay people. So they just looked like monsters out of it. And again, they didn't. It was a policy that they already had one that supported. They just didn't go for the specific one. And now basically the headlines are saying the Conservative Party has refused to acknowledge that climate change is real. What do you think of that tactic, and what do you think of the outcome after a long segue into that?
Well, so first of all, I think that the federal Conservative Party really has to decide if it wants to be elected. So if it does want to be elected, then it needs to look at where Canadians at large are. And although it does make some conservatives uncomfortable, the reality is, according to all polling data through a whole various sources out there, that Canadians do consider climate change an important issue that they would like to see the federal government deal with. So I guess the problem for the Conservative Party that I've argued now for some time is that, and this will make some of your listeners initially a little nervous, is that they should embrace the issue. They should take it on as their own. And they should say to Canadians, yeah, we believe that climate change is a serious issue. And more importantly, we have an alternative solution to what the existing status quo is on how to deal with the issue. So, for example, we hear about we need to find a way to reduce carbon. Well, I'm of the opinion that taxing something doesn't really reduce carbon. So I would argue, let's look at Alberta, at all of those great oil sands operations throughout Alberta. There are significant lithium deposits. And there's an opportunity where the Conservative Party could have said, we believe in climate change, and the way we want to combat it is through a national mining strategy where we try and get all of the provinces in Canada from Newfoundland to BC on the same page, and we will supply the lithium to the electric vehicle market globally. We will supply the nickel, we will supply the platinum, we will supply the gold, so on and so forth. Another thing the Conservatives could have done is they could have talked about hydroelectric power. You know, there's a renewable, clean source of energy that Manitoba has vast, vast quantities of. Same thing with British Columbia, same thing with Quebec, same thing with Newfoundland. And the Conservatives had nothing to say. All they did was they spent the entire weekend saying, we believe in change, we believe in change. We are going to vote down the climate change issue, but we believe in change. So, you know, I think this was an opportunity where they could have showed Canadians that they have a plan, that they could have put a plan together. And instead, you know, people walked away from that wondering, what does the party want? What does it mean by change? What, you know, and I think that's not going to help them. I think that's actually going to lead to their defeat. And that's because they don't have a policy roadmap.
Well, ambiguity is just a killer, you know, because it all really comes down to trust then. And we don't have a lot of trust in our politicians on any level these days, the public at large, I think, and in general. So we need to see things laid out. In the West, when we see ambiguous policies or ambiguous statements saying, you know, we're going to tackle climate change, but we're not saying how, well, then we do start saying, well, what are you talking about? And we're nervous. We've been beaten on a lot here. We've dealt with C-69, C-48, you know, tanker bans, carbon taxes. What is it? More of the same? We get nervous, our backs get up. We need you to lay it out. As you said, here's some things we can talk about. We'll still produce in the oil sands, but we can also, we've got this byproduct of lithium. I mean, we can participate in the larger market, in the changing market. I mean, a pragmatic approach. I like that, but the party isn't touching it. Something Danielle Smith spoke of it, I believe, before as well at a different conference was carbon could be a resource, actually. There's some pretty creative products coming up. I mean, when we're talking about carbon capture, that you may be able to do things with that carbon rather than just sequester it. Let's get creative. Let's look at what our resources are. Likewise, though, when we see the Conservatives being, you know, again, cagey or showing ambiguity with climate and environmental policy, people who are more concerned about it in Central or Eastern Canada say, well, does that mean you're just actually not going to do anything and you're paying lip service to it? So, I mean, I see this approach as perhaps losing support and trust on both fronts, which is a bad recipe for an election.
Well, I agree with you. And quite frankly, I'm uncomfortable with the Conservative Party always framing these discussions of, we need to do something for the West, or we need to do something for Atlantic Canada, or we need to do something for BC. I think what they should start doing is talking to Canadians. So whether you're a Canadian that lives in Calgary, or you're a Canadian that lives in Halifax or Toronto, people have the same sort of concerns and worries. You know, the concerns and worries, like we can, you know, the climate issue is one, pocketbook issues is another, you know, retirement savings is another issue. Where are their kids going to go to school? But instead of talking to Canadians, they're determined for some bizarre reason of speaking to specific regions. And when they speak to those specific regions, they do it in such a manner that you've alluded to, where they don't talk any sort of policy. They just say, like, well, we need to stand up for people in this part of the country. Well, great. What does that mean? You know, and to your point, there's all kinds of innovation. There's all kinds of technology out there where we can take existing things that various regions are good, whether it's Alberta or Saskatchewan or whoever, and, you know, we can embrace those other things, lithium, nickel, all of this kind of thing. And it sort of gives you something to strive for. You know, I think the other problem that the party has had, quite frankly, is I like to call it an identity crisis. So is it a political party that's interested in being elected? And is it a party that wants to govern Canada? Or is it a moral movement? And the reason I argue this is because if it's interested in governing Canada, then it will focus the discussion on things that matter to the largest number of Canadians, which is pocketbook issues, which is, you know, how to make the climate issue your issue, fiscal responsibility, those kinds of things. If, however, it's intent on sort of having these discussions related to morality, whether it's abortion, equal marriage rights, these kinds of things, they're going to lose every time, because unfortunately, if we look at the 2019 election, you know, the Conservatives they beat the Liberals in the popular vote, but they lost the election. And I argue the reason they lost that election was that when the leader was questioned on a basic thing like, do you support gay marriage? And he sort of paused and hummed and hoed and wasn't really sure how to answer the question. It left a lot of Canadians all over the country sort of scratching their heads and wondering, who is this guy? And so, you know, they need to be able to take on these moral issues in a way where they say, look, I understand that so-and-so might be a social conservative or so-and-so might have some personal moral views. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they also need to be able to say, as a government, we are not going to be touching any of those issues because that's not the role of government. It's not to get into the business of morality, essentially.
Yeah, and that gets dicey. And again, when somebody dodges on it, you start losing support on both sides because you seem untrustworthy. So
Exactly.
we do have regional issues, though. And I mean, that's part of, you know, as Stephanie's kind of pointing out, and this has been going on since the beginning of Confederation. I think we've got a real systemic problem, actually, you know, with just the way we're laid out. And it makes for a difficult juggling act for any government or somebody trying to form government to address. I mean, you made a great point in pointing out, look, there's a lot of things we have in common. We still got concerns about our jobs, our wallets, our healthcare, our education. That's universal across the country. But we definitely have some different points of view between Saskatchewan and Alberta versus British Columbia versus Nova Scotia. And of course, Quebec is definitely a distinct zone of its own.
Well, you know, Cory, not to interrupt you, but I noticed, so one of your viewers of the television program here today, I think the name was Stephanie, stated that, you know, that the Conservatives need to ditch the West in order to win the East. I have problems with that description as well, because I know you know this, you know, as well as anyone. What do people mean by the West? I mean, British Columbia, the Conservatives currently, as they're set up right now, are in a distant third place in British Columbia. And the last time I checked, British Columbia is as far west as you can get in Canada. If we look at Manitoba, the Liberals are in firm contention in Manitoba. It's essentially a two-way race. So, you know, if people in Alberta or Saskatchewan are deciding that they are the West and they will speak on behalf of the West, well, there's a lot of people in Manitoba and BC that are going to feel a little different about that. And so to your point, and to what I was saying earlier, it's important that we find those issues, those pocketbook issues, those economic issues that unites Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Otherwise, they're never going to win. And so if you don't want to win, then, you know, why run for government? You know, why not just join an advocacy group? Or why not write letters to the editor or what have you? You know, if you're going to get into the political realm, you have to deal with the circumstances that are there. And the circumstances in the political realm is to win. And the reason I say that is because your worst day in government is far, far better than your best day in opposition. And that's just an undisputed fact, because when you're in government, you can affect change. You can bring about policy change. You can embrace innovation. You can embrace technology. You can do all of those things that you can't do in the opposition. If you're in the opposition, you're basically criticizing from the sidelines. And I don't see any benefit to that. I really don't. I think it's a waste of time.
You know, I will differ a little bit on that front with getting back to the 90s when I was really, you know, getting through into politics myself and that. With
I remember that era quite well, actually.
Yeah. And I mean, the Chrétien Liberals, if nothing else, and I despise them as a government, but they were pragmatic and they knew how to get stuff done. But part of that was because there was a Reform Party breathing down their necks and a very effective opposition. I think the Reform started losing some of its ability when they started diluting. But then it can be argued it took a long time, but eventually that led to the Harper Conservatives getting in, you know, into the 2000s and bringing about some conservative government for a change. But we've just got such it seems cyclical. It just never quite stops. And again, I blame the system rather than the people. It does force, as you said, the goal is to get in. If you want to make real change, you've got to be in. You've got to be in government. And the only way to win government realistically, is to win Central Canada. There's no getting around that. That's just math. That's not opinion.
That's right.
And but that's part of what drives the West wild, because we do have some policy differences, and that's why we see these spikes in secessionism, which we're really seeing one right now, because of the frustration of feeling like, well, that might be the only thing.
Well, look, I would argue that there's not really that many policy differences between the quote-unquote West and the rest of Canada. I mean, obviously, I know the big issue is the pipeline issue. So, what I always argue with conservatives is that arguing about the Energy East pipeline when you know that the province of Quebec, for a whole host of different reasons, is not going to play ball is a waste of time. It's a waste of energy, pardon the pun. Arguing about British Columbia, why British Columbia doesn't want to play ball, again, I argue that's a waste of energy. I think you're always better in life to look at a problem and rather than complain about the problem, find a solution. So I've argued, and I've argued this now for a number of years, that the solution for Alberta and Saskatchewan energy exports, in order for that product or those two products, gas and oil, to reach Tidewater, you have to look at Manitoba. You have to look at the Hudson Bay. And that, if we look at the Port of Churchill in northern Manitoba, that is the answer. Whereas, I know that beating up on Quebec and to a lesser extent British Columbia is really great for the Conservative Party from a fundraising perspective. It lets them do those mail out letters that they like to send out every month, and they say, hey, we need you to contribute $10 or whatever it is. But if they're really interested in finding a solution, what they will do is they will look to Manitoba as the answer. So I'm sure you might have a different perspective or maybe the same ideas, but that's how I view it. And just to circle back to your earlier discussion point, I'm not really sure that it was purely the opposition federally, in this case, the Reform Party. I think it played a role in Jean Chrétien's government. But there's a lot of other components to this that people often forget. So if we look at Alberta, and I know it's not my home province, but you had a very successful provincial government in Alberta under Ralph Klein that was able to eliminate the provincial deficit and then go one step further and eliminate the provincial debt. In Ontario, you had the Mike Harris government that was also very simpatico, if you will, with Ralph Klein in Alberta. And then even you had liberal governments like Frank McKenna in New Brunswick. And then, of course, you had a federal opposition party with the Reform Party that talked a lot about fiscal responsibility. And so that definitely made things easier for the federal Liberals. The fact that you had provincial government consensus and you had a federal opposition consensus. But I think the other thing that your listeners or your viewers may forget, and Jean Chrétien has made no hidden secret about this, is that his political hero wasn't Pierre Trudeau. His political hero was Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And it's important for people to remember that Sir Wilfrid Laurier was probably the most free enterprise prime minister that Canada had, or many people would argue that he was probably one of the most free enterprise prime ministers that Canada ever had. So, you had a combination of Jean Chrétien's personality and his political heroes. You had really effective provincial governments at sort of promoting the same sort of issue. And then, of course, you had an opposition party that was also on board. So that, that allowed for the 90s to be a really unique time period in Canadian politics, I would argue.
Yeah, fiscal responsibility was in the 90s. There's no doubt about it. Even the Saskatchewan NDP actually were moving towards balancing their budget. The pressure was on everywhere. I like to think in the future we're going to come into a period of, well, it's going to be austerity, unfortunately, but as we're spending like mad, somewhere at some point, all of these these governments are going to have to rein this in. I mean, again, I'm not talking about opinion. I'm talking about math. You can't do this. Hyperinflation is going to hit us pretty hard and pretty soon, I suspect. But getting back to, and speaking of reform and speaking of politics, so that it really did reform, made it difficult for a conservative government to form again for a long time, because of course the Mulroney, and then Kim Campbell, conservatives were completely decimated at the start of the 90s. A lot of that was due to votes bleeding off to reform in the West and just a complete rejection of them in the East, because reform only ran in the West. But reform was also... And
also, to be fair, we had the creation of the Bloc Québécois at that time federally. Yeah. And so you had federal liberals and federal conservatives leaving their respective parties to form the Bloc in Quebec. So to your point, that led to a decimated federal conservative party, all those vote splits occurring in different parts of the country.
Oh, yeah. People forget Lucien Bouchard came from Mulroney's cabinet initially, I believe. But reform was a response to, again, what I keep coming to is kind of a broken system, unfortunately. We were frustrated in the West again. We were ticked off. It's funny, if you want to get the West mad, we get far more angry when a conservative government screws us than when a liberal one does, because we expect the liberals to screw us. But the CF-18 contract with Mulroney, that one cut deep. And that was in Manitoba, for those who don't remember. But there was a what was it, Bristol Aerospace, I believe?
So to be fair, and just to put my cards on the table, I've been a guest speaker at some of the aviation industry in Manitoba in the past. So yes, it was Bristol Aerospace, yes, in Winnipeg, who has since become known as Magellan, in fact. Mm-hmm. And then you had Bombardier in Quebec, but those are stories from 30 years ago. But I mean, to circle it back to today, I think the bigger problem is that the Conservatives need to be electable. And so, I generally believe that Aaron O'Toole made a strategic mistake speaking directly to the party at the convention rather than using that opportunity to speak to Canadians at large. And I think if we look at the polling data over the last 2 months, it's been horrendous. And so the national polling data, depending on the polling firm, has the Conservatives anywhere from 23 to 28%. And that's really problematic, because you and your viewers know that the Conservatives have kind of a healthy built-in head start in Alberta and Saskatchewan that sort of boosts their national number. And the worry in that is that if we look at the polling data, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative or a negative way, but if we remove Alberta and Saskatchewan out of that equation, what that means is that the federal Conservatives drop from 23 to 28 to like 20 to 25. And so that tells me that they're simply not competitive in British Columbia, in Atlantic Canada, in Quebec, and in Ontario. And to some extent, Manitoba is kind of in play. So the Conservative Party, its leadership, its national council, the Conservative Fund of Canada, all of those components of that big blue tent, they need to figure out how to appeal to Canadians at large. Because for the last 6 months, it's been an abysmal failure, quite frankly.
Yeah, no, there's no avoiding that. I mean, whatever the winning strategy might be, that's debatable. But there's no doubt that the current strategy is a losing one. They aren't getting there. And I mean, that's part of what just a head scratcher. I mean, it's not like the Trudeau Liberals have provided this brilliant, strong leadership and morality and clean governance or anything of the sort. I mean, they've proven themselves to be borderline corrupt, if not, beyond borderline, with the Wee affair and SNC Lavalin, and ineptitude seems to kind of range a bit when we're looking at vaccine distribution, and if we're playing on the gotcha politics of cancel culture. My Lord, this Prime Minister has been seen in blackface multiple times. And even with all of that, we can't seem to chip into that liberal armor. I mean, I guess we can't be relying on them to screw up in order to win. That's what it should be teaching us. That's not going to be enough. people want to vote against the Liberals, fine, but they need to vote for something. And the Conservatives just can't seem to figure out what that for is yet.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that point. I don't believe that it's good enough to say, well, let's wait for the existing government to screw up. So there's this old adage that says that opposition parties don't form governments. Governments throw themselves out of power. I don't think that sort of thinking applies in the year 2021. And the reason I don't believe that applies is because we do have this global medical pandemic that, with COVID, that's happening everywhere, that is allowing governments of all political stripes to have a bit more support than what they normally would during normal kind of economic times. Because, I've always argued along with other people that in times of crisis, whether it's right or wrong, that large numbers of the populace will rally around their respective governments rather than try to take down their governments. And so to your point, I think the Conservatives need to actually put out, a detailed policy roadmap. And I think that they need to be honest, and they need to really talk about it. And saying like, we want change, and not telling us what the change is not good enough. And, they really need to find these answers. And if they don't, well, they're going to, there's not a lot of runway left, right? So if we think of the Conservatives as a big blue jumbo jet, there's a short amount of runway, and they got to get that plane in the air. And they're running out of runway. And that means the likelihood of a victory is shrinking every day. And, that means taking some really hard, serious decisions. And I agree with Aaron O'Toole, by the way. Like, I want to go on the record of saying I agree with Aaron that the Conservative Party needs to accept change. Now, what that change is that he has in mind, I have no idea. I mean, I've laid out sort of what I view as a roadmap, right? And that's fiscal responsibility, embracing innovation and technology, putting together a national mining strategy where you can take advantage of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba's resources in order to supply the global EV market. Look at the hydroelectric power from British Columbia, from Manitoba, from Quebec, from Newfoundland. Tie that all into like a national Canadian grid, so to speak. Those are policy things where the Conservatives could enter the election campaign, and they could go into the leaders' debates, and they could say, look, this is what we want to do. And then you could let Canadians make an honest decision as to which vision they prefer more. But as it stands right now, if it's just empty platitudes of change, well, then I believe, unfortunately, that the existing government will be reelected. And that, if you're the Liberal Party, that's great. They're happy about that, because I think they're betting on the fact that the Conservative Party and the people within the Conservative Party lack the ability to sort of talk about bold vision.
Yeah, well, and getting back to, so, I mean, a lot of our audience, again, predominantly is in the West, and there's just, again, a lot of regional frustration, and how that we spawn new political parties. We do it all the time. We've historically done it from way back to the Progressives, up to Reform, up to the CPC, and provincially we do it as well. So we've got other ones now. It's not Western, but there's the PPC out there. We've got Maverick Party, which a number of people have mentioned now. And Dave Borkman, who's commenting, he's been working on forming yet another federal incarnation of an alternative out there. I don't believe any party's in any position to win seats at this point, but they can most definitely still impact things. Like, this is core supporters, volunteers, donors, and sometimes perhaps in swing ridings on a Conservative Party that really can't afford to lose those 1 or 2% or 5% here and there.
Well, and I mean, to your point, so I don't mean to interrupt you. So with some of those opposition, or some of those other sort of what I like to call fringe parties, some of them are actually not only bad for the conservative movement, but they're just bad for Canada in general. So if we look at like the PPC, for example, because, you hear people sort of on the fringes will mention them in passing occasionally. The problem with those guys, quite frankly, is that their immigration views are out to lunch. And the reason I argue that is if people in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other parts of the country care about the economy and care about finances and things like that, the number one way that you could kill off the Canadian economy, quite frankly, is to shut down immigration. Because what we have seen over the last 3 or 4 years is that Canada's retirement rate, according to Stats Canada, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 500,000 Canadians a year are retiring. So, those are people leaving the workforce. Then you add another somewhere in the vicinity of 300,000 Canadians a year are dying just, through natural causes and those kinds of things. That means you're left with a big gap that you need to make up in your workforce, in your economy, in order to keep things moving. And if we look at the Canadian birth rate, that's been on a downward spiral now for 2 decades. And it's not at a high enough rate in order to make up for the death rate and the retirement rates, which is why immigration is important. So to circle this back around to some of those fringe parties, those policies of no immigration or bare minimal immigration and these kinds of silly ideas, they would turn our cities into towns, our towns into villages, and our villages would cease to exist. So, immigration is good for the Canadian, for Canada, and it's good for the Canadian economy.
Yeah, immigration is one where people have taken a short-sighted view of it at times, and we see it all over the place. The bottom line is you get the old, they're coming and stealing our jobs. Well, no, immigrants are taking actually quite often jobs that you didn't want. I did a lot of work in managing projects down in South Texas and Louisiana, Pennsylvania, through the states. And in seismic with the recording crews, they're 90% Mexican people. And I'll be blunt, we knew most of them were illegal. They would show up at the safety meeting one morning and there would be a whole bunch of different faces. They're all working under the same green cards. But don't get upset at them. Nobody else was applying for the bloody job. And you need the job done. And that's just
not only do you need the job done, but you have people that are willing to do the jobs, that are willing to put in the work. They want to be part of our society. They want to be part of our country. And in the long term, it benefits all of us as a nation. Whether you live in Alberta or Newfoundland or British Columbia or Quebec, immigration is good for Canada. And so, this is why I argue that the Conservative Party really needs to sort of be bold, take on a big vision, start talking about these big policies, whether it's Hudson Bay, whether it's a national mining strategy, whether it's a national hydroelectric power grid, whether it's pocketbook issues. It's got to take these issues on. It's got to embrace them in a way and sell them to the public at large. If it just wants to fight these old, antiquated ideas that immigration is bad and that we don't believe in climate change, well, they're going to lose every single time, especially if you combine that with the inability to answer basic questions on things like gay marriage or abortion. And, I know some of your viewers may disagree with me on this, and that's fine, but I'm convinced more than ever that is the roadmap to success.
Yeah, well, an interesting point I just brought up out of Stephanie, which is true, but that's just the change of Western demographics in the Western world. There were some very influential books actually back in the 60s and 70s that turned out to be mostly hogwash, but it was the population time bomb and the population explosion, and everybody was told that we're going to overpopulate, the world's going to be in a catastrophe, so you got to stop breeding. And well, only Western societies could afford to take on that sort of tactic, and we moved on to much more of a society that has 1 or 2 or even no kids, which is fine. But that does lead to, we need that ongoing generation of immigrants to come in to help pay for the retiring people moving out. It's not an opinion thing. It's a common sense thing, but it needs to be sold because an uninformed vote is still a vote nonetheless. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know that 2020 was a unique set of circumstances because of COVID, but Stats Canada released some numbers this week that showed Canada's immigration in the year 2020 is the lowest it's been in over a century. That we had less than 0.5% in population growth. I think it was like 0.4. So you don't need many years like that with the kind of high retirement rates and the sort of the high death rates and the low birth rates to very quickly discover that your economy is going to collapse in a relatively short period of time. So this is why I don't pay much attention to these fringe parties, because they really don't have any sort of ideas. And a lot of them are essentially a pimple on the ass of the conservative elephant. And I would much rather be the elephant than a pimple on the elephant.
Yeah, well, they're an expression of frustration with the status quo, though, and something we're going to see is they started fringe, particularly federally, but I mean, people called reform fringe when it got going too, and it did take off. They had to evolve, and they had some pretty crazy anti-reform stuff initially, or anti-immigration stuff, but they moved beyond it. But it took a lot of work. I mean, Preston Manning was good at keeping it to a reasonable voice. And something we've got in the West, and you'll see that more and more, in commenters with our listenership, separatism is higher than I've ever seen in my life, and it's growing. And you've got to be careful. I mean, I don't want to see it as some threat saying, if you guys vote Liberal again this time around, we're separating. But the reality is, if there's another election and we're still looking at Prime Minister Trudeau, particularly with a majority, I think we're going to see a referendum out here in the next few years. And that's just, I think the system's broken and that might be what we need, but that's more of an anarchist sort of approach to it. So, but this is going to be a critical election on a number of levels, I think.
Well, so this is where you and I sort of have divert on this this discussion, I guess. So I don't buy, and I know I'm not in Alberta, and I don't pretend to be in Alberta, but I don't buy into the argument that we're looking at a referendum for a couple of reasons. So again, this may make your viewers uncomfortable, but this is my thoughts on it.
All right.
So I think that if the Conservatives lose provincially, I know, based off of all of the polling data, that Rachel Notley and the New Democrats will form government in Alberta. And you're never going to see either Jason Kenney and the Alberta Conservative Party, nor Rachel Notley and the New Democrats talk about a referendum. The other thing I think that's important to remember in all of this is that despite the conservative side of the ledger, if you will, being extremely successful in Alberta federally, if we look at the breakdown of the vote, let's say 50%, they win 50% of the popular vote. That still means that 50% are voting for Liberals, a combination of Liberals and New Democrats, even though they're not necessarily winning seats. And so all of that is important, because when people start talking about referendums and these kinds of things, the reality is in order to win a referendum, you need to be able to win. And I don't believe they can win. And I think drawing comparisons to Quebec is a strategic error and a strategic blunder, quite frankly. And the reason I argue that is because the Bloc Québécois, which is what people often point to when they talk about the Maverick Party in Alberta, is that the Bloc was made up of Liberal and Conservative MPs who left their respective parties in order to form the Bloc. And just as important, it had the full support, backing, and endorsement of the provincial Quebec government, the Parti Québécois. So it had real infrastructure in place on the ground, both provincially and federally. I don't believe for 1 minute that you're going to see a bunch of Alberta Liberals or Alberta New Democrats leave their respective parties in order to champion the secession of Alberta. And I know that might make you, I know you might disagree with me on this, but I don't believe that the people advocating this maverick idea have really fully thought this out. And the other thing, quite frankly, is that if you really want to help the federal Liberals win more seats, then go ahead, support Maverick, because that's going to create vote splits, which will allow all kinds of federal Liberals to be elected in Edmonton and Calgary and, all over the place. So I don't think that this has been fully thought through. And I also think as well, and I know this puts me sort of on the outside of these things, but I also believe that that the Maverick Party is not necessarily what they are pretending to be. And I believe that under the right political circumstances, that if the federal Conservative Party can get its act together and become competitive on the national scene, that you would see the Maverick Party dissolve rather quickly and most likely throw its support behind the federal Conservatives.
Well,
I threw a lot there at you, I know. So.
Oh, yeah, no, and we're coming towards the end. That's fine. I didn't bring you on to agree with everything I was saying, or I would just talk throughout the entire thing, and then people would get quite bored. And I do agree with a good deal of it. But it's good. There's a lot to unpack, a lot discussed, and we're in a turning point of a pivotal year. So, I mean, we'll be able to get together and talk about how our projections and ideas came about as time passes, pre-election yet, hopefully, and post-election as well, and we carry on. But it's the discourse that's important, and you're offering a perspective from Halifax, which we don't get a lot out here, which is important because whether the secessionists among us here like it or not, we are still in a confederation, and these federal elections are all take the participation of the entire country in them to determine who's going to win it or lose it in the end. So it's all well worth discussing. I really appreciate you coming on with me today for this first show. It was lots to cover, and there's always lots more. And
just on a different note, I do, setting aside anyone's personal preferences, either for the Liberals or the Conservatives or whatever, I do believe that it's imperative for the federal Conservative Party to be a competitive national party. And the reason I argue this is because in a parliamentary democracy like we have, no matter who is the current government, whether it's this Liberal government or a potential future Conservative government, you always want a functioning opposition that has the capability of forming government. And the reason you want that is because that keeps governments on their toes. It helps keep governments honest. It helps governments question whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And if you don't have an effective opposition voice that is capable of replacing whoever the government of the day is, that is generally when you start to see serious mistakes happen. And so I am concerned as a Canadian citizen that I do want to see a functioning political party system in this country. And that's just my thoughts on it.
No, much appreciated. So just in closing, where could people, if they want to talk to you or find you or see what you're talking about, what you're up to, what's the best places to do so?
Best place to find me is on Twitter, Clinton Desveaux. You can see the spelling of my name on the screen there. I write on a regular basis for Troy Media on issues of technology, innovation, disruption. I also write for Medium, and I do radio and television broadcasts and internet broadcasts like this as well. And hopefully you guys will have me back. I really enjoyed this today.
Oh, I'm certain we will. Thank you very much again, and I'm sure we will be talking again. Okay, well, that brought us right to the top of the hour here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Clinton. Thank you, Frank. And for you viewers, listeners, watchers, I'm tuning in on this first episode of this, and enduring a little bit of the technical difficulties, which were to be anticipated, I guess, in our first round. So tomorrow night there will be a special with Danielle Smith again, and she'll be talking on COVID again, which is so important, and so few people are doing it now. And we will be back on Friday from 10 till noon to carry on with the Cory Morgan Show. If you got ideas, things you want covered, thoughts, send them on to me. You can private message me. Find me at Cory B. Morgan on Twitter. And there's contact information at Western Standard as well. So thanks again.